listener production.
Hi there, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. What would it take for you to stop buying your morning cup of coffee? If you think price might have an impact, you won't want to miss today's deep dive as we explore the many factors, from weather to trade laws, which could affect the cost of a cup in 2025.
Companies like McDonald's and 7-Eleven and things like that, they buy commodity-grade coffee. And I think it might be a hot take, but I think those companies will probably have to increase their prices by percentage the most.
That's coming up after the headlines with Chris Spiru on Monday, December 9.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Rebel forces have declared Syria is liberated from the rule of President Bashar al-Assad following their capture of the country's capital. Scenes of celebration have swept the streets of Damascus, marking the collapse of more than 53 years of al-Assad family rule and a seeming end to a 14-year-long civil war.
Yeah, this all started to unfold just under a fortnight ago when a coalition of opposition fighters launched a major offensive in the country's northwest. Chris, what do we know about that?
Yeah, so we know that they were led by Turkish-backed and registered terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, so HTS for short. Within days, forces had taken control of the country's second largest city, Aleppo, which we reported on last week. And then they went on to control another two cities before circling the capital over the weekend. According to reports, President al-Assad fled Damascus yesterday, and Russian media is reporting he and his family have now arrived in Moscow. It's important to note his regime was backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah by proxy, all groups who are otherwise preoccupied at the moment, Sash.
What can you tell us about the group that is now seemingly in power, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
So they're an Islamist, militant and political group that traces its roots to the beginning of the 2011 Syrian civil war, so 14 years ago. They are classified a terrorist organisation, and its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, he was a founding leader of al-Qaeda in Syria. And that is a group now that HTS has formally severed its ties with as of 2016. So that was a very public thing, and that was quite significant in the Middle East. Al-Jalani sat down with CNN for an exclusive interview over the weekend where he says he will introduce structure in what he's describing as a government for all Syrians.
Syria deserves a governing system that is institutional, not one where a single ruler makes arbitrary decisions. No one has the right to erase another group. These sects have coexisted in this region for hundreds of years, and no one has the right to eliminate them. There must be a legal framework that protects and ensures the rights of all, not a system that serves only one sect, as Assad's regime has done.
And that was on the back end of a question asking about minorities and how minorities will fall into this, government and governance. Interestingly, given what's happening with the Taliban and Afghani women at the moment, there is a lot of stress and, people are quite afraid of what could happen to women in the region. And as terrifying as it is, time will tell.
Yeah, and this is likely to send ripple effects throughout the Middle East. And I wanted to look next at how the world has reacted to this news. Starting in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has hailed the fall of al-Assad, a major ally of Iran, as an historic day, also saying it was a direct result of blows dealt to Hezbollah and Iran by Israel itself.
Yeah, and as for the US, the White House has issued a statement describing it as extraordinary, and President Joe Biden has just had this to say.
At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty.
France has also responded, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, posting on X that the barbaric state has fallen, and he also paid tribute to Syrian people, to their courage and to their patience.
Yeah, and as for Iran, their foreign ministry has also come out with a statement. They say that they respect Syria's unity and national sovereignty, calling for an end to military conflicts and terrorist actions, and they're hopeful that national dialogue can finally take place, which, again, an interesting position.
You mentioned it at the top, but the scenes of celebration have been pretty widespread across Syria, and a lot of expatriates who were forced out of the country during the civil war have started to return back, even with this uncertainty, because let's remember, nothing is set in stone yet. This regime has been overthrown, this new group has come in, but that's as much as we know. And it's interesting because Australia also welcomed a ton of Syrian refugees. So as of the 2016 census, there were 15,000 people born in Syria who were living in Australia, and that represented a more than 80% increase from the 2011 census, and that was the start of the civil war, which is really interesting to see just how many people were forced to flee and find refuge in other countries around the world. Back home, there's another poll out today spelling potential trouble for Labor and Anthony Albanese ahead of next year's election. So this is from the latest Resolve Political Monitor, which has surveyed more than 1,600 voters, finding 60% of them feel worse off under the current government. Just 13% say they feel better off. When asked which party and leader they thought would do the best job of tackling the cost of living, 37% said Peter Dutton and the Coalition, compared to just over a quarter who backed the PM and Labor. And I think it's important, that political issues like the cost of living really come back to bite parties. We have heard lots of different reasonings as to why certain decisions haven't been made throughout this process. Why haven't we cracked down on the Reserve Bank? There's a lot of talk about how that would then affect the economy in another way. So voters are going to make Labor pay for what has gone on, even if Labor maybe couldn't have controlled all factors of the cost of living crisis. But yeah, according to yet another poll, people are feeling pretty hard done by. Look, meantime, over the weekend, Albanese did come out to label the firebomb attack on a Melbourne synagogue as terrorism.
The atrocities that occurred at the synagogue in Melbourne clearly were designed to create fear in the community and therefore, from my personal perspective, certainly fulfil that definition of terrorism.
Yeah, so the Adass Israel synagogue in the suburb of Ripponlea was severely damaged in an arson attack, sparking extra police patrols of Jewish worship places and a community vigil yesterday morning. Today, federal and Victorian police will meet to decide whether to officially designate the incident as a terror attack, Sash.
Yeah, investigations are continuing as well, and police did give an update saying that progress had been made to try and determine who carried out this attack, but no arrests have been made at this stage. Yesterday at the pro-Palestine rally in Melbourne, which is held every weekend, organisers there spoke out against this attack and called it anti-Semitism. So there's, everyone's on the same page with this, that it's just an atrocity. Albo did cop criticism earlier on the weekend for stopping short of calling it terrorism. Of course, Peter Dutton and the Coalition coming out to slam that decision. Dutton said it was a deliberate decision to play down anti-Semitism, which he said had made the Jewish community less safe. Albo has since come out yesterday afternoon to say personally he thinks it's a terrorist incident. He also pointed to examples of how he has fought anti-Semitism, outlawing Nazi symbols, criminalising doxing and appointing an anti-Semitism envoy. And he also announced that a $25 million fund that's available to help pay for security measures for the Jewish community would be extended to a second round. So that'll include an additional $32.5 million over the next 18 months.
Yeah, and as you rattle all that off, I kind of think about the comments that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made over the weekend where he condemned the attacks. He called them an abhorrent act of anti-Semitism, and he tried to link it to the position of the Albanese government, which he labelled as anti-Israeli. So he said, unfortunately, it is impossible to separate this reprehensible act from the extreme anti-Israeli position of the Labor government in Australia. Again, given everything that you've just listed and all the powers that Albanese has used and the laws he's enacted, I don't know, I question the validity of his comments, really. And Donald Trump has made his first overseas trip as president-elect, attending the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and meeting with Ukraine's president, France's president, and none other than Prince William, who is sporting a beard that Sacha Barbagat is very fond of.
Shh, I hate it.
His time in Paris kicked off with a meeting with Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky. Apparently, Macron had to convince Trump to meet with Ukraine's leader, but afterwards, the incoming US president posted to Truth Social official calling for an immediate ceasefire between Kyiv and Moscow. Trump has repeatedly promised to end the war between Ukraine and Russia by his first day in office.
Next up, the president-elect, along with French dignitaries, Jill Biden and even Elon Musk, attended the grand reopening of Notre Dame, which, of course, was famously ravaged by fire in 2019 and has been completely restored at a cost of more than $1 billion Australian dollars. And after that, he met with the Prince of Wales.
Good man, this one. Hello, everybody. Doing a fantastic job.
So what you just heard there, I know it's a little bit echoey and you can hear the cameras clicking, but that's that formal initial handshake that is always filmed by the media. Trump actually stopped at the doorway and Wills was standing quite a few steps back and it forced him to walk towards Trump and extend his hand. I don't know whether it was a power move, but I got power move vibes from that. Apparently the pair discussed the relationship between the UK and America during their 40-minute chat. Also worth noting, there was this official reception held at the Elysee Palace ahead of the Notre Dame reopening ceremony. Now there, Trump got the red carpet treatment, and that was complete with trumpets blaring and members of the Republican Guard in full uniform.
Oh, wow.
Now, that is usually reserved for sitting US presidents, and there's been a bit of commentary over the weekend about how France will be feeling pretty happy that they've managed to get the president-elect on side and they've done this big show for him to be like, hey, like, you know, let's be friends. There was also, though, this really awkward handshake between Trump and Macron at the reception. Trump's arm goes, I'm trying to describe it. I know this is a podcast, but his arm kind of goes at like a 90-degree angle and he's trying to like pull Macron into him. So we're back to the Trump power plays on the world stage, which, you know, it's pretty entertaining to watch. Whether you like his politics or not, I can't help but laugh at some of his antics on the world stage. Chris, thank you so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, it is our deep dive looking into the cost of a cup of coffee in 2025 and how that might all change.
We've all complained about the price of a cup of coffee. So how much should we actually be paying? Well, global coffee prices have reached their highest in over 50 years. And this is because of poor weather in Brazil and Vietnam, where most of the world's coffee comes from, which in turn is forcing roasters like Nestle to bump up prices. So when will we start to feel the pinch here in Australia? And what does this mean for our local coffee spot? With some experts saying that we're actually underpaying for coffee in Australia and that more cafes need to close. Kirk Pearson is the owner of Project Zero Coffee and the host of It's Just Coffee, the podcast. Kirk, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Why are global prices at their highest in nearly 50 years?
What's really set it off is a really big change in weather conditions in Brazil. They've had long sort of protracted periods of drought or no rain, and there's certain times of the coffee harvest cycle that you really need rain for the plants to yield more coffee. So because they haven't gotten that rain, the plants have all just yielded significantly less coffee than they have in previous years. So laws of demand and supply would dictate the coffee price has gone up. And Brazil is the biggest producer of coffee on the planet by a very long shot, followed by Vietnam. And Vietnam's also experienced something similar. So adverse weather conditions that have really meant they've yielded significantly less coffee. There's a lot of people competing for that coffee as well. So coffee markets or people purchasing coffee, big companies overseas are all competing for that. Really, like there's the same amount of coffee demanded, but there's less available. So everyone's having to pay more for it.
Yeah. So is this what we might have been saying about big companies and big, I guess, roasters bumping up the prices because of that? Is that why that's happening?
Yeah, partially. I think one big shock that the industry's experienced recently is that there's a massive company in China called Luckin Coffee, and they've purchased 240,000 tons of coffee from Brazil this year, so which is massive. So Luckin Coffee, I think they might even have more stores than Starbucks now. So they're massive in China. They're expanding to other parts of Asia. They have plans to expand to America, and they can't really... Obviously, when you've got that type of goal of expansion in mind, they can't really risk not having coffee. So they've just purchased a whole bunch of it at a fixed price, and it's probably caused a stir, which has increased the commodity market.
Who is going to be impacted the most by the rises?
Initially, probably coffee roasters. So it'll be a trickle-down effect. So coffee roasters obviously have to ensure their own supply. And so the price for them will increase. So there's a difference between like Melbourne coffee drinkers and Australian coffee drinkers are very familiar with what's known as specialty coffee. So there's a scoring system with coffee and it's to 100. Anything over 80 is considered quote unquote specialty. So below 80 is the commodity market. So companies like McDonald's and 7-Eleven and things like that, they buy commodity grade coffee. And I think it might be a hot take, but I think those companies will probably have to increase their prices by percentage the most. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a 7-Eleven coffee charging $2.50 or $3 next year and Coles Express sort of moving similarly. Obviously, the after effect of that is that coffee roasters will increase the price that they're paying to cafes, and so cafes will experience a cost increase of their goods, and then the trickle-down effect is that they have to on-charge that to the customers, and that's where it gets pretty difficult. Melbourne coffee drinkers or Australian coffee drinkers in general just culturally do not want to accept coffee price increases. And a lot of cafe owners and coffee roasters are really quite frightened to increase their prices, and for good reason too.
Yeah, so you have your own coffee shop, you have your own small business. How would this impact someone like yourself? And if you say that fear of increasing prices in this cost of living crisis, would that really impact your business?
We're in the city and we actually are surrounded by so many cafes there, and our coffee is the most expensive, and we invest a lot in making sure that it's really good. We use a lot of technology and things like that, and we're getting busier and busier. And so the impact, I think, on the market, like when you think about coffee consumers, coffee customers going to buy coffee, I actually think that there's kind of like a fork in the road of the industry. A lot more people will probably be driven to 7-Eleven and McDonald's, but I think a lot more people will be selective about where they shop. So they'll go to places where they're probably guaranteed a good experience. And to be honest, I really get that myself. Like if you're going to pay $6 or $7 for a coffee, and then it's pretty fair to expect that to taste good. And so I feel like cafes that deliver consistently the best quality coffee, they'll probably be the winners in this, because consumers will be pretty conscious. And as you guys know, Melbourne and Sydney customers are pretty onto it in terms of coffee quality. So I actually think, yeah, a lot more people will be driven to your 7-Elevens and McDonald's, of course. We're in a cost of living crisis. But it's those middle tier cafes that, can't produce the consistently excellent coffee. And to make coffee really well, there's a lot of actually chemistry, mathematics, and physics involved in it if you really take it seriously. And that's not something that at our store we really bother the customer with. But you can use all those things to make consistently better coffee. And the outcome is people come and spend their money more frequently.
Yeah, and Australia does have this really rich coffee environment and industry, and yeah, take it pretty seriously. And around the world, we're known to have pretty good coffee. I know a lot of Americans say that all the time, and when Aussies, when we go overseas, we do struggle to find a good coffee. I have heard this chatter in the industry that considering how good our coffee is and the high quality and the high standards we do have, that we're actually not paying enough for coffee in Australia. What do you say to that?
Well, that's 100% true. So I've spoken to plenty of friends that have gone overseas recently. My girlfriend just she flew overseas to India via Hong Kong, and she paid something like 15 Australian dollars for a coffee at the airport. And that's pretty regular in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, I never really want to, and cafe owners alike, I don't think we ever want to see that come to Australia. That's a lot. Maybe there's regulations or taxes there that I'm not privy to that kind of necessitate that price. But compared to a lot of countries overseas, yeah, absolutely, we pay significantly less despite the cost of producing a coffee here being probably higher. So coffee's purchased internationally in US dollars, and when the Australian dollar is weak compared to the US dollar, it automatically means that we pay more. And then, of course, you add in there's a lot of difficulties with shipping internationally at the moment. So Australia's got very inefficient ports. When there's strikes at the ports, that doesn't help things either. And then when there's things like the Suez Canal blockage or the conflict in the Red Sea, it kind of makes complications in shipping, which also further increase the price. But it's just culturally, like we just do not accept price increases for coffee or high prices for coffee, and no one really wants to pay more. I get that. I'm the same. But it's really a cultural phenomenon in Australia that we do not, we resist coffee price increases a lot.
And why do you think that is?
Because we love it so much. with things like fuel increases, like obviously it's an essential good. Whether or not you like it, you have to pay it. Same with electricity, and there's a whole bunch of utilities that we pay that whether you like it or not, you just have to. Coffee, it's almost like an essential to an Australians. It's something we depend on, we rely on. And in my day-to-day, we serve plenty of customers that work in office buildings. And I think one of the things they need is to be able to get out of their office once or twice a day, go get a bit of fresh air, get a walk, and get a nice refreshing coffee from a friendly face. And so when that's kind of threatened, I think it just raises a lot of anxiety. And there's also a lot of like media hysteria around this as well. A lot of the, particularly television media, they cover this story, and I see it on social media too, but it's very alarmist and in a lot of ways untrue. I think there's a lot of misinformation produced by networks in Australia about that. So even in the context of what we're experiencing right now, there's going to be increases, but I don't think they're going to be as high as what a lot of news companies and stuff like that say it is.
Speaking of those increases and what has been kind of floating around, like, oh, my coffee is going to be $10 or $12, or how much will my cup of coffee actually be affected by? How much would the price actually go up by these global rises?
Well, that's a good question. And let's put this in perspective. So the commodity price for coffee at this time last year, so on December 4th in 2023, it was like flat $2 per pound US. When I checked last night, it was $3.03 per pound. So that's a 50% increase in prices. It won't be that much. You're not going to get a 50% price rise, don't worry, because I think Australian coffee roasters and cafes are aware you have to be able to compete. I just think if you increase it to like $8 or $9, it wouldn't be productive. And we're not really there yet, in my opinion. So honestly, I think $6 plus is probably the new norm. At our cafe, we charge $5.50 for a flat white, and we make the decision to not charge extra for alternative milks as well. So your soys, almonds, oats, etc. So we just have a flat price. But heading into 2025, I think, we'll probably have to consider $6 plus. And I think that'll be pretty consistent across Melbourne and Sydney. Unless there's something else, unless the price rise that we get from our suppliers is significantly higher, I don't think you'd expect too much more than that.
One question we did have around the office that I think a lot of Aussies grapple with, especially when we get into kind of summer days, why is an iced coffee sometimes almost double the price of a hot coffee?
Honestly, I don't understand that either. That's something we don't do. A lot of cafes don't actually invest in good equipment like ice machines and things like that. There's a big trend toward cold drinks in pretty much the world, to be honest, like globally. And you would have seen it here in Melbourne and perhaps Sydney too, but probably because they just know that consumers will pay more. That's not to say that it's, in all cases, it's not worth it, but I had someone come in to me the other day and say they paid $10 for an iced soy latte. And even I looked at that and I was like, whoo, that's pretty spicy.
What can you tell us about the consumer behaviour you've seen in the past year? You touched on this before, that with the cost of living, you've still been really busy. Do you think that going into the new year, Aussies will prioritise still getting that cup of coffee even if the price increases?
I don't think it's going to stop a lot of people. Like, people are still going to drink coffee. Australians have proven time and time again that they've just got this insatiable desire for coffee. But like I was saying before, they'll be a lot more selective about where they go. So cafes that make the effort to make consistently good coffee will probably be rewarded. And a lot of cafe owners, this might get me cancelled, I don't know, but they don't really know how to work with what they've got. Like, a lot of the coffee industry is surprisingly ill-informed on how to make a really great coffee and how to use their beans in a way that makes it go a lot further. So, I mean, there's a lot of good educational tools like Barista Hustle and, James Hoffman online. He's got a YouTube channel, so I won't just drop that out there and not inform anyone, but there's plenty of great resources. To be honest, there are some pretty hazy days ahead for the cafe industry, but a lot of cafes probably the spiciest thing I'll say all day, a lot of the cafes in Australia probably need to close. We have more cafes now in Australia than we did before COVID by like 7,000 or something. So there's so many more businesses competing for a smaller customer base. And so it's probably actually a good thing that a lot of cafes will close. And that's very harsh to say, but I think a lot of people in the industry would agree there's just too many cafes in Sydney and Melbourne and probably across the rest of Australia.
Yeah, well, I guess it will be interesting to see what next year holds and if that will happen with these price rises and consumer behaviour. But yeah, Kirk, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Pleasure, and thanks so much for having me on.
Kirk Pearson there, owner of Project Zero Coffee and the host of It's Just Coffee, the podcast. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love to know what you pay for your daily coffee. And if you think you're paying too much or not enough, you can shoot us a DM on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And hey, if you want to share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it too, it really does help us build the podcast. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another episode from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.